Question number 5 of Secunda Secundae, as we continue on this treatise on the theological virtues, is a very interesting question. 4 articles, and it has to do with of those who have faith. Okay, we know faith is one of the theological virtues, as we learned in the previous question, and we learned about acts of faith, but who actually is able to have faith? Okay, so we look at the various rational or intellectual creatures, like the angel, like I have a picture here. Can angels have faith? St. Thomas Aquinas is going to ask about, what about the demons? Can they have faith? Did Adam and Eve require faith before the fall, after the fall? These are the kind of things that St. Thomas Aquinas is going to ask in these, and it's quite fascinating to consider these questions. And I want to also just kind of remind you that one of the goals of this channel, these videos, this run through the Summa that we're doing right now, is to try to tie things together. And that's really been my purpose in this, is that I have to kind of sequentially go through these questions in order to start to tie things together. And as we talk about faith, and the object of all the theological virtues, of course, is, as we learned in the first question here, the first truth, which is God himself. You might be reminded that the first question of the Summa had to do, way back in Prima Pars, had to do with sacred doctrine. And the very first article of the Summa said whether besides philosophy any further doctrine is required. And if I don't know if you saw that video. It over a year ago we did that one. And Aquinas said, you got to have something besides what we can know through natural knowledge, because our end is supernatural. Our end is beyond us. And so God's going to have to teach us about something beyond us. Otherwise, we wouldn't even know what to set our sights on, or what our goal would be. Heaven, hell, all these things like the Trinity. This is all beyond our ability to figure it out on our own. Okay, so now with these theological virtues, through the infusion of these virtues, through the infusion of grace, we're able to connect ourselves to God intellectually and also through the will through these 3 theological virtues. All right, so having said that, he says, whether there was faith in the angels or in man in their original state. I've read this before, but as I read this time, it's really interesting, because if you remember in the treatise on the angels were created, and then like in the next instant they had to make a decision, because they had this infusion of knowledge, and they had everything that they needed to know in order to make a decision for or against God, right? And many of the angels made the right decision, and many of them didn't, and so those are the fallen angels, or the demons, and then we have the good angels. But I think what St. Thomas Aquinas is doing right here is he's looking at that moment, as instantaneous as it may be, before they made the decision. And did they have faith? Did they require faith? And what about Adam and Eve before the fall? And again, these are the kind of things, this is what makes Thomas Aquinas so brilliant, is that he thinks of these kind of things. So let me read this. I find this really interesting. Some say, says Thomas Aquinas, that there was no faith in the angels before they were confirmed in grace or fell from it. Okay, this is that instantaneous moment before they had to make their decision. And in man before he sinned, by reason of the manifest contemplation that he had of divine things. So what did they have? Remember, Adam and Eve had graces before the fall that they lost, and they had a lot of, we did a video on this. Okay, I'm sorry, I keep referring back to previous videos that you may or may not have seen, but they had graces and blessings and knowledge and virtues that were lost. And so this is what he's zeroing in on. He says, since, however, faith is the evidence of things that appear not, according to the apostle, and since by faith we believe what we see not. And by the way, in the previous video yesterday, I referred to the author of Hebrews as being St. Paul, which St. Thomas Aquinas does refer to St. Paul as the author of Hebrews. In modern day theologians, that's no longer really believed to be the case. And so yesterday I was kind of talking like St. Thomas Aquinas would talk. I think not many theologians believe that St. Paul wrote Hebrews. In fact, they don't know who wrote it, but Thomas thought that St. Paul wrote it, okay? So according to Augustine, okay, that Manifestation alone excludes faith, which renders apparent or seen the principal object of faith. So when you have the beatific vision, you no longer need faith. Okay, people in heaven don't need faith. Beatified angels don't need faith, right? Now, the principal object of faith is the first truth, the sight of which gives the happiness of heaven and takes the place of faith. So right now we need faith because we're sojourners here on the earth, but once we get to heaven, we can throw the faith aside because we don't need it. But now we need it. Consequently, as the angels before the confirmation in grace and man before sin did not possess the happiness whereby God is seen in his essence, it is evident that the knowledge they possessed was not such as to exclude faith. Okay, they didn't have the beatific vision, so they needed faith at that point. Now, he says it follows then that the absence of faith in them could only be explained by their being altogether ignorant of the object of faith. All right, they didn't have the beatific vision. They didn't know about this yet, but faith is what helps us realize that it exists. Okay, we have intellectual knowledge of our final end. And if man and the angels were created in a purely natural state, as some say, perhaps one might hold that there was no faith in the angels before their confirmation in grace. Okay, if they were strictly natural and nothing that was, God was not providing them any kind of grace or any kind of assistance, right? Or if man before sin, because the knowledge of faith surpasses not only a man's, but even an angel's natural knowledge about God. So again, he's looking at that area, that instantaneous moment with the angels, and then that period of however long it was with Adam and Eve before they sinned, right? That's interesting. So finally, since, however, man and the angels were created with the gift of grace, we must needs say that there was in them a certain beginning of hoped for happiness by reason of grace received but not yet consummated. So they were given some grace. They were given a little sense of hope of what their final end was, just like we are, as baptized Christians, we are given that infused virtue of faith, and then we're going to have to decide whether or not we're going to respond to it or not. Which happiness was begun in their will by hope and charity, and in the intellect by faith. Consequently, we must hold that the angels had faith before they were confirmed, and man before he sinned. So, short answer is yes. The angels did have faith, and Adam and Eve did require faith before the fall. Whether the demons is their faith. Okay, the fallen angels, the demons, do they have faith? And Thomas says the believer's intellect assents to that which he believes, not because he sees it either in itself or in resolving it to first self-evident principles, but because his will commands his intellect to assent. Now, I've said often about this fascination I have with the way that the intellect and the will work together. So even though, as we've already talked about, the intellect is the faith is primarily related to our intellect. Once we know what it is that is the object of our faith, which is the first truth, we still need our will to assent to it. Okay, the will is that part of it which kind of makes that decision, so to speak, that we're going to assent to that object of the faith. Now, that the will moves the intellect to assent may be due to two causes. First, through the will being directed to the good, and in this way we believe is a praiseworthy action. Secondly, because the intellect is convinced that it ought to believe what is said, though that conviction is not based on objective evidence. Now, he's going to explain this a little bit more. Okay, here's an example. He says, thus, if a prophet, while preaching the word of God, were to foretell something and were to give a sign by raising a dead person to life, the intellect of the witness would be convinced so as to recognize clearly that God, who lieth not, was speaking, although the thing itself foretold would not be evident in itself, and consequently the essence of faith would not be removed. So the prophet reveals something that the person would have to take on faith, but then he shows signs. He's working miracles. And the person says, well, this must be of God if the miracles are being worked. So keep that in mind, because the demons see the miracles. They see what Jesus did. They see all this, but then they still, through the act of their will, they don't assent to the objects of faith. That's what Thomas is going to say. Accordingly, we must say that faith is commended in the first sense in the faithful of Christ, and in this way faith is not in the demons, but only in the second way, for they may see evident signs whereby they recognize that the teaching of the church is from God, although they do not see the things themselves that the church teaches, for instance, that there are three persons in God, and so forth. All right? I hope that made sense. That's interesting. Whether a man who disbelieves one article of faith can have lifeless faith in other articles. So I'm going to see if I can summarize this one, okay? So the answer is no. And this relates to what we call in modern day cafeteria Catholicism. Can I believe everything that the church teaches except for that teaching on the angels, or except for that teaching on the Trinity, or except for the bodily resurrection? And Thomas says no. He says you can't do that because, and this is very important, is that faith is, and faith means assenting to that first truth, which is God himself, right? And God established a church. So you're either going to be all in assenting to the teachings of the church, which was established by Jesus Christ, or if you start to cherry pick which ones you don't want to believe, it's no longer your will assenting to the object of faith, which is the first truth. It's now your will making its own decisions. So you're no longer assenting in any way to faith, because as soon as you say, well, I think Holy Mother Church made a mistake on this one, you no longer really have faith in any way. So Thomas does not believe in cafeteria Catholicism. All right, can faith be greater in one man than in another? And he says the quantity of a habit may be considered from 2 points of view. First, on the part of the object. Secondly, on the part of a participation by the subject. So you have the object of faith, of course, the first truth, and materially all the things related to the first truth. And then the subject means us. We are the ones who have or don't have faith. Now, the object of faith may be considered in two ways. First, in respect of the formal aspect, which is the first truth. Secondly, in respect of the material object, which is proposed to be believed. Formal object of faith is one and simple, the first truth, as stated in the first question. Hence, in this respect, there is no diversity of faith among believers, but is specifically one in all, because there's only one truth, right? There's one God. There's one formal, truth. But the things which are proposed as the matter of our belief are many and can be received more or less explicitly. And in this respect, one man can believe explicitly more things than another, so that faith can be greater in one man on account of its being more explicit. And I think, you think about somebody that's really brilliant, like, Scott Hahn, or, whatever, Tolkien, or C.S. Lewis, or, I don't know. C.S. Lewis wasn't even Catholic, but they have a greater capacity to know, and maybe they were taught better, and maybe somebody had better teachers. And so I think that's what he's getting at here. Okay, if on the other hand we consider faith from the point of view of the participation by the subject, this happens in two ways, since the act of faith proceeds both from the intellect and the will. Consequently, a man's faith may be described as being greater in one way on the part of his intellect on account of its greater certitude and firmness, and another way on the part of his will on account of his greater promptitude, devotion, or confidence. Okay, so really interesting. This is a great question, these articles, in really splicing and dicing where intellect and will are separated, where they work together with regard to the act of faith. And so I hope that helped you. I hope it makes sense. It certainly is fascinating to me. So thank you for spending this time with me, and we'll move on to question 6 of Secunda Secunda in the next video.